Elena Monroe arrived at the boarding gate with the quiet efficiency of someone used to navigating busy airports. Dressed in a tailored navy pantsuit and carrying a sleek leather briefcase, she exuded a calm authority that naturally turned heads. Her steps were measured, her expression serene, and her demeanor one of deliberate self-possession. As the flight attendant scanned her boarding pass, Elena offered a polite nod before stepping onto the jet bridge. It was a routine she had performed countless times: a business trip, a first-class seat, and another city waiting at the other end. Yet, even in the predictability of this moment, there was an unspoken tension, the kind that clings to the air like humidity after a summer storm. Inside the aircraft, Elena took her time finding her seat, marked clearly with the bold letters denoting her place in the first-class cabin. As she settled into the plush leather chair, she placed her briefcase neatly beneath her seat and pulled out a slim notebook. Her pen moved effortlessly across the page, capturing notes for the meeting ahead. She seemed to exist in her own world, unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, of the quiet stares that lingered just a moment too long. Passengers trickled in, some glancing at her before quickly looking away. Others didn't bother to hide their curiosity, their eyes darting to the boarding pass in her hand, as though questioning whether it belonged to her. Elena had seen it all before: the subtle hesitations, the quick flickers of judgment, the unspoken question, "What are you doing here?" A few rows behind, Catherine Wells observed the scene with an expression that was difficult to read. The senior flight attendant had been with the airline for over a decade. Her sharp eyes trained to assess every detail in the cabin. Her uniform was immaculate, her smile polished, yet there was a stiffness to her movements as she made her way through the aisle. When she reached Elena's seat, Catherine paused, her lips tightened ever so slightly before she spoke, her tone neutral but clipped. "Good afternoon, ma'am. May I see your boarding pass?" Elena glanced up from her notebook, momentarily surprised by the request, but her expression remained composed. She handed over the pass with a polite smile. "Of course." Catherine examined the ticket carefully, as if searching for a hidden flaw. "First class," she remarked, more to herself than to Elena. "Yes," Elena replied evenly, her voice steady and unbothered. "That's correct." Catherine returned the pass without further comment. Her brows knitted slightly as she moved down the aisle. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like a routine interaction, but Elena noticed the tightness in the flight attendant's jaw, the way her gaze lingered just a beat too long before moving on. Elena let the moment pass. She had long ago learned to choose her battles carefully. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Minutes later, Catherine reappeared, her demeanor more resolute this time. "Ms. Monroe," she began, her voice now carrying a formal edge, "I need to speak with you privately for a moment." Elena closed her notebook, setting it aside with quiet precision. She rose gracefully, retrieving her briefcase without a word, and followed Catherine to the narrow galley at the front of the cabin. The space was cramped, the hum of the aircraft engines filling the silence between them. "I've checked our records," Catherine said, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "It appears there's been a mistake with your booking. I'm afraid I'll need to move you to a seat in the main cabin." Elena tilted her head slightly, her brows drawing together in a subtle expression of confusion. "A mistake? I booked this ticket weeks ago." It was confirmed. Catherine's posture stiffened. "I understand, but I'll have to insist. This seat isn't suitable." For the first time, a flicker of something passed through Elena's otherwise calm exterior. Annoyance? Disbelief? It was hard to tell. But just as quickly, she regained her composure. "I see," she said, her tone measured. "May I ask why my seat is no longer suitable?" "I don't have time to explain," Catherine replied, her voice sharpening. "You can move voluntarily, or I'll have to involve security." For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The air between them felt heavy, charged with an unspoken conflict that neither fully acknowledged but both understood. Finally, Elena nodded once, curtly. "Very well." She returned to her seat, collected her belongings, and walked toward the rear of the plane with her head held high. Passengers turned to watch as she passed, their whispers like static in the air. Elena ignored them all, her grip tightening slightly on her briefcase as she settled into the cramped middle seat Catherine had assigned her. Through the cabin windows, the late afternoon sun cast a soft golden light over the rows of seats, bathing the plane in a deceptive warmth. To most passengers, it was just another flight, another minor inconvenience they could ignore. But for Elena, this was something far more insidious, a quiet, almost mundane reminder of how prejudice often hides in the fabric of the everyday. Reaching into her bag, Elena retrieved her phone and typed a brief message. Her face betrayed no emotion as she hit send. Then, for the first time since boarding, a faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips, not a smile of amusement, but one of quiet resolve. The flight continued its steady ascent, the clouds thickening outside the windows, and somewhere within the quiet hum of the engines, something had already begun to shift. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin, a constant backdrop to the quiet shuffle of passengers settling into their routines. Elena Monroe sat in the cramped middle seat of the economy class, her briefcase stowed neatly beneath her feet. She stared out the small, oval window, the endless expanse of clouds offering no answers, only the faint reflection of her own composed face. Around her, the atmosphere buzzed softly with unspoken curiosity. A few passengers glanced her way, their gazes quickly darting back to their magazines or screens when caught. Others whispered to one another, their voices a low murmur lost in the steady rhythm of the flight. Elena noticed it all but chose not to react. She had no intention of giving the moment more power than it already held. In the narrow aisle, Catherine Wells moved through the cabin with brisk efficiency, offering drinks and snacks with a practiced smile. Her demeanor seemed unchanged, but there was a slight tightness to her movements, a rigidity in the way she avoided looking in Elena's direction. Whether it was guilt or simple unease, Catherine carried it with her, like a weight she didn't quite understand. Back in the galley, Robert Grayson, a senior flight attendant with a warm, steady presence, finished prepping a tray of drinks. His sharp eyes caught Catherine lingering by the storage compartment, her shoulders unusually tense. "Everything okay?" Robert asked, his tone casual but laced with curiosity. Catherine hesitated before responding. "It's fine," she said, not meeting his gaze. "Just a minor issue with a passenger earlier. It's handled." Robert leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. "Handled? You've been tense since takeoff. Doesn't seem like it's handled to me." Catherine sighed, finally turning to face him. "I had to move someone. There was an issue with their seat." Robert raised an eyebrow. "An issue? Or just a gut feeling?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Look, I didn't feel like she fit in first class. Something about it felt off." Robert's expression hardened. "She had a ticket, didn't she?" "Yes. But," Catherine began, only to be interrupted by his sharp tone. "Then it wasn't your call to make," he said evenly. "You know better than to act on instinct like that. Passengers notice these things. Management notices these things." Catherine's jaw tightened, and she turned away, busying herself with arranging cups on a tray. "I was just doing my job," she muttered. "Were you?" Robert asked softly. His words lingered in the small space long after he had walked away, leaving Catherine to stew in the quiet. Blank. Blank. Meanwhile, in the economy cabin, a younger flight attendant approached Elena with a cautious smile. Maya Hart was in her late 20s. Her movements gentle and deliberate as if she sensed the tension surrounding Elena but didn't want to intrude. "Ma'am, would you like some water?" Maya offered, holding out a small plastic cup with both hands. Elena turned away from the window, her expression softening at the sight of Maya's genuine concern. "Thank you," she said, taking the cup with a polite nod. Maya hesitated, her gaze flicking briefly to Elena's briefcase tucked beneath the seat. "If there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to ask," she added, her voice kind but careful. Elena studied her for a moment, sensing the unspoken understanding behind Maya's words. "You've been very kind," Elena said quietly. "I appreciate it." Maya smiled, her cheeks tinged with a faint blush. "It's my job," she replied, though her tone suggested it was more than that. As Maya walked away, Elena allowed herself a moment to reflect on the contrast between Maya's warmth and Catherine's cold dismissal. It was a reminder that even within the same system, people could choose how they treated others. Elena's phone vibrated softly in her lap, snapping her back to the present. She glanced down at the screen, her face betraying no emotion as she read the brief message from her assistant. Chloe spoke with the executive office. They're aware of the situation. Keep me updated. Sliding the phone back into her bag, Elena folded her hands in her lap, her fingers tapping lightly against the smooth fabric of her pants. She wasn't angry, not in the way people expected anger to look. Her fury was quiet, deliberate, sharpened into something more useful than outrage. She had learned long ago that battles won with calm precision often left the most lasting impact. Blank. Blank. At the front of the plane, Catherine stood by the first-class cabin, her polished smile faltering for just a moment as a passenger asked for another drink. She poured the requested beverage with mechanical efficiency, her mind elsewhere. In her peripheral vision, she caught sight of Elena seated far down the aisle, her composure unshaken, her presence somehow louder in its silence. For the first time, Catherine felt a flicker of doubt. Something about Elena's calm unnerved her. It wasn't defiance or anger, it was a quiet strength. An unspoken assertion of her right to exist exactly where she belonged. No matter what others thought. As Catherine returned to the galley, she found Robert waiting for her. His arms crossed again. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes said enough. Without a word, Catherine busied herself with refilling trays, the quiet weight of Robert's disapproval hanging heavy between them. Blank. Back in her seat, Elena sipped her water slowly, her gaze returning to the clouds outside. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow across the sky. To anyone watching, she appeared perfectly serene, almost detached from the world around her. But inside, her mind was sharp and focused, already shaping the next steps of her response. Prejudice, she knew, often thrived in the everyday, in the subtle, seemingly insignificant moments that passed without question. It wasn't loud or overt. It was the glance that lingered too long, the assumption left unchecked, the power wielded without thought. And it was this quiet, persistent prejudice that Elena had resolved to confront, not with anger, but with action. As the plane continued its smooth flight, the tension in the cabin seemed almost imperceptible, woven into the ordinary rhythms of the journey. But for Elena, the currents of change had already begun to stir, steady and inevitable, like the slow build of a coming storm. The cabin had settled into a rhythm of quiet activity. Passengers flipped through magazines, tapped on screens, or simply stared out at the expanse of clouds beyond the windows. To most, it was just another flight. But for Elena Monroe, seated in the crowded economy cabin, the flight had become a stage where an all-too-familiar story was unfolding. Elena sat with her hands resting lightly on her lap, her posture straight but unassuming. Her calm demeanor masked the undercurrent of thoughts running through her mind. This wasn't the first time she had been judged unfairly, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But Elena had long since learned that indignation alone rarely changed anything. Quiet, calculated action was where real power lived. Her phone vibrated softly in her bag. She pulled it out discreetly, reading the message from Chloe. Executive office notified. They've escalated to the captain. We'll update soon. A faint smile flickered at the corner of Elena's lips, not triumph, but a quiet acknowledgement of progress. She typed a brief response before slipping the phone back into her bag. Around her, passengers remained oblivious to the invisible gears now turning above them. Blank. At the front of the plane, Catherine Wells was beginning to feel the weight of her choices. She moved through the first-class cabin with practiced precision, checking on passengers and answering their requests. But her usual ease had been replaced by a growing unease, a sense that the situation was no longer entirely within her control. As she passed by the galley, she caught a glimpse of Robert Grayson, his expression unreadable as he watched her. She avoided his gaze, busying herself with the task of refilling water glasses. But the memory of their earlier conversation lingered, his words circling in her mind like a song she couldn't shake. You assumed, he had said, his voice calm but firm. And now you're dealing with the fallout. Catherine had brushed him off at the time, too defensive to let his words land. But now, as she glanced toward the economy cabin and caught a fleeting glimpse of Elena, sitting poised and composed, she felt the sting of his judgment more acutely. It wasn't that Catherine regretted her actions, at least. Not yet. But there was something about Elena's presence that unsettled her. As if the woman carried with her a quiet power Catherine couldn't quite grasp. Blank. Blank. In the cockpit, Captain Lucas Bennett sat reviewing a report from the airline's executive office. The message was clear. A passenger in economy, one Elena Monroe, had raised a serious concern. She was not just any passenger, the note emphasized, but someone with direct ties to the airline's board of directors. Lucas leaned back in his seat, his expression thoughtful. He had seen situations like this before, where a small decision made in haste unraveled into something far bigger. Catherine Wells, he murmured, recognizing the name of the flight attendant involved. She had been with the airline for years. Her record largely clean, but there had been a few minor complaints, nothing significant. Until now. Is there an issue? The co-pilot asked. Glancing over, Lucas shook his head. Not yet, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Picking up the intercom, he called the cabin crew. Catherine, can you step into the cockpit for a moment? Blank. Catherine's heart sank when she heard the captain's voice. Setting down the tray she was holding, she made her way to the front of the plane, her steps slower than usual. By the time she entered the cockpit, Lucas's expression told her everything she needed to know. Close the door, he said, his voice even but firm. She obeyed, standing awkwardly near the controls. Is something wrong, Captain? Lucas folded his arms, leaning back in his seat. We've received a report from the executive office. They're concerned about your handling of a first-class passenger, Ms. Monroe. Catherine's face flushed, and she quickly tried to explain. There was an issue with her seat. I thought. Stop. Lucas interrupted, holding up a hand. I've read the details. This wasn't about a mistake in booking. Was it? Catherine hesitated. I didn't think she fit the profile of a first-class passenger. She admitted reluctantly, the words tasting bitter as she spoke them aloud. Lucas's expression hardened. You didn't think she fit? Based on what, Catherine? Her ticket was valid. Her behavior was professional. What exactly didn't fit? Catherine looked away, unable to meet his gaze. It was a gut feeling. She mumbled. Lucas sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. Gut feelings are not policy. This airline doesn't operate on instincts. Catherine, we operate on facts and professionalism. And from where I'm sitting, your actions were neither. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of consequences still to come. Finally, Lucas spoke again, his tone softer but no less firm. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to personally apologize to Ms. Monroe and ensure she's treated with the respect she deserves for the remainder of this flight. When we land, you'll file a full report, and the executive office will decide what comes next. Is that clear? Yes, Captain, Catherine said quietly, her face pale. Good, Lucas said, turning back to his controls. Dismissed. Blank. Catherine returned to the cabin, her movements stiff and robotic. As she walked past the first-class passengers, she felt their curious eyes on her. Sensing the tension in her demeanor, she paused at the curtains separating the cabins, her hand gripping the fabric for a moment before she pushed through. Elena looked up as Catherine approached, her expression calm but unreadable. Catherine forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Ms. Monroe, she began, her voice quieter than usual. I wanted to personally apologize for the inconvenience earlier. It was a misunderstanding on my part. Elena tilted her head slightly, studying Catherine with an intensity that made the flight attendant shift uncomfortably. After a long moment, Elena offered a polite nod. Thank you, she said simply. Catherine stood there for a beat longer, unsure if there was more she should say. But Elena had already turned back to her notebook, her attention seemingly elsewhere, taking the dismissal for what it was. Catherine retreated to the galley, her thoughts swirling. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Elena remained still, her pen gliding across the page of her notebook. She wasn't writing about the incident itself, she didn't need to. Instead, she outlined the steps she would take once the plane landed. The people she would contact. The changes she would advocate for. This was no longer just about her. It was about every passenger who had been dismissed, judged, or belittled simply for existing in a space others didn't believe they belonged. Outside the window, the sky had turned a deep shade of orange, the sun dipping below the horizon. The flight continued smoothly, the engines humming softly as the plane pressed forward. But within the cabin, the quiet ripples of change had already begun. Subtle but unstoppable, like the first stirrings of a long-awaited storm. The flight had settled into its quiet routine, the soft hum of the engines mingling with the occasional clatter of drink carts and muffled conversations. In the main cabin, Elena Monroe sat by the window, her notebook closed on her lap. Her gaze rested on the endless stretch of clouds outside. But her mind was elsewhere, each thought deliberate and precise. Across the aisle, a fellow passenger, a man in his 60s with a kind face and silver hair, glanced over. He'd been watching the situation unfold since boarding, his curiosity piqued by the quiet tension surrounding Elena. After a moment's hesitation, he leaned slightly toward her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly, his voice warm but tentative. "I couldn't help but notice earlier. Are you doing all right?" Elena turned to him, offering a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine," she replied, her tone measured. "Thank you for asking." The man nodded, sensing she had no intention of elaborating. "Well, if you need anything, just holler. Doesn't sit right with me." "What happened?" Her smile softened, and for the briefest moment, her guard dropped. "It doesn't sit right with me either," she said, her voice low but firm. Blank. Underscore. Blank. At the front of the plane, Captain Lucas Bennett stood in the cockpit doorway, his arms folded as he watched Catherine Wells approach. The narrow corridor seemed to stretch longer with each step she took. Her usual confidence replaced by an uncharacteristic uncertainty. "Come in," Lucas said, stepping aside to let her enter. The cockpit was quiet. The co-pilot focused on the instruments while Lucas closed the door behind them. He gestured for Catherine to stand near the small fold-out seat, his gaze steady and unreadable. "Do you understand why I called you in here?" Lucas asked, his tone calm but carrying an edge. Catherine hesitated, her hands fidgeting at her sides. "I assume it's about Ms. Monroe," she said finally. "You assume correctly," Lucas replied. He leaned against the control panel, his eyes never leaving hers. "I received a call from the executive office about 10 minutes ago. They're not happy." Catherine's face paled. "I didn't mean." "Stop," Lucas interrupted, holding up a hand. "This isn't about what you meant. This is about what you did." She swallowed hard, her mouth dry. "I was following my instincts," she began, her voice faltering under his steady gaze. "Something didn't feel right. I thought." "What you thought," Lucas cut in, his voice sharper now, "was irrelevant. Ms. Monroe had a valid ticket. Her behavior was professional. There was no reason to move her. And yet you did. Do you understand what that looks like?" Catherine's silence was answer enough. "I've been in this business for over 20 years. Lucas continued, his tone softening slightly. "And I've seen this pattern before. It's not always intentional, but that doesn't make it less harmful. You looked at Ms. Monroe, and you decided she didn't belong. Whether you realize it or not, that decision wasn't based on her ticket or her actions. It was based on something deeper." Catherine felt her cheeks flush with heat, a mix of shame and frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "It wasn't about." "It was," Lucas said firmly, maybe not consciously, but it was. "And now, we're in a situation where one poor decision could have far-reaching consequences, not just for you, but for this entire crew and the airline." The weight of his words settled heavily between them. Catherine stared at the floor, her usual sharpness dulled by the realization of how quickly her instincts had betrayed her. Lucas let the silence linger before speaking again. "Here's what's going to happen. You will go back to Ms. Monroe, and you will apologize sincerely. No excuses. No justifications, just an apology. You will also ensure she receives the highest level of service for the remainder of this flight. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Captain, Catherine murmured, her voice barely audible. Good, Lucas said, his tone softening. And when we land, you'll file a report detailing your actions. The executive office will decide what happens next. Catherine nodded, her throat tight as she turned to leave. Just as she reached the door, Lucas called after her. One more thing, he said. Take this as a lesson. Assumptions have consequences, sometimes bigger than you realize. Blank. Blank. Back in the economy cabin, Elena noticed the subtle shift in the air as Catherine approached. The flight attendant's usual brisk efficiency was replaced by slower, almost hesitant movements. When Catherine stopped at Elena's row, she forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. Ms. Monroe, Catherine began, her voice quieter than anyone had heard it before. I wanted to personally apologize for earlier. It was a mistake on my part. And I deeply regret any inconvenience I caused. Elena tilted her head slightly, studying Catherine with a calm intensity that made the flight attendant shift uncomfortably. After a long pause, Elena offered a polite nod. Thank you for your apology, she said evenly. I appreciate it. Catherine lingered for a moment longer, as if waiting for something more. But Elena had already turned back to her notebook, signaling the conversation was over. Catherine retreated to the galley, her shoulders stiff and her mind racing. Blank. Elena exhaled softly as she closed her notebook. She wasn't interested in Catherine's apology, it was too little. Too late. What mattered now was what happened after the plane landed. She reached for her phone, typing a quick message to Chloe. Captain briefed. Apology given. Prepare follow-up for tomorrow. Sliding the phone back into her bag, Elena allowed herself a small moment of satisfaction. This wasn't just about her experience, it was about ensuring no one else would have to endure the same. The rest of the flight passed uneventfully, the tension lingering but subdued. Catherine avoided Elena's gaze, focusing instead on her tasks with a mechanical efficiency that betrayed her inner turmoil. The passengers, sensing the undercurrent of discomfort, busied themselves with books and movies, leaving the moment to quietly fade into the hum of the engines. As the plane began its descent, the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the horizon. Elena looked out at the clouds one last time, her thoughts steady and clear. This was just the beginning, she reminded herself. Real change took time, but it always started with a single step. And today, she had taken it. The plane touched down smoothly, the familiar jolt of wheels meeting tarmac pulling passengers from their quiet reveries. Seatbelt signs chimed off, and almost immediately, the overhead compartments came to life with the clatter of bags and the shuffle of travelers eager to disembark. Elena Monroe remained seated, her posture composed, her movements unhurried as others around her scrambled to gather their belongings. She reached for her briefcase and placed it deliberately on her lap. Her gaze fixed out the window. The city stretched far beyond the runway, a maze of lights and movement, bustling with stories far larger than the one unfolding on this flight. But for Elena, the moments that followed would ripple outward, far beyond this cabin or this day. Blank. In the first-class cabin, Catherine Wells busied herself with routine tasks, collecting trash, smiling tightly at passengers as they departed. Her usual confidence was missing, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. The captain's words still echoed in her mind. Assumptions have consequences, sometimes bigger than you realize. She stole a glance toward the back of the plane, where Elena sat quietly. Catherine couldn't decipher what unnerved her more: Elena's refusal to react with anger or the calm, unshakable authority that seemed to radiate from her every movement. The latter, she realized, was the part that frightened her. Elena was not just a passenger she had inconvenienced, she was someone who carried herself as though she already knew how this story would end. As the last few passengers filed out, Catherine caught sight of Robert Grayson, who gave her a brief but pointed look. He didn't say a word, but the weight of his disapproval hung between them. Catherine turned away, busying herself with a tray of empty glasses, her fingers trembling slightly. Blank. blank. Elena stood as the aisle emptied, waiting until the cabin had all but cleared before making her way toward the exit. Her steps were deliberate, her briefcase in hand, her gaze steady. As she approached the door, Catherine stepped forward, her smile still tight, her voice carefully measured. "Thank you for flying with us, Ms. Monroe," Catherine said softly, though her words lacked the usual warmth she reserved for first-class passengers. Elena paused, meeting Catherine's gaze for the briefest moment. There was no hostility in her expression, no satisfaction, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had passed between them. "I'm sure we'll be in touch," Elena replied, her voice calm but carrying a weight that Catherine couldn't ignore. As Elena stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool air from the terminal greeted her, a stark contrast to the stifling tension of the cabin. Two airline representatives stood waiting for her, their tailored uniforms immaculate, their expressions carefully professional. One extended a hand in greeting. "Ms. Monroe, thank you for your patience," the woman said, her tone warm but tinged with formality. "We've been informed of the situation, and we're here to assist in any way we can. The executive office has already been notified, and they've assured us that this matter will be addressed promptly." Elena shook her hand, nodding politely. "I appreciate the follow-up," she said. "I trust the airline understands the gravity of this incident." "Absolutely," the representative replied, glancing at her colleague before continuing. "If there's anything further you'd like to discuss, our team is available at your convenience." Elena gave a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll be in touch. Blank. Blank." As Elena walked through the terminal, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. She thought of the countless moments like this, instances of subtle injustice that passed unnoticed by those not directly affected. A flight attendant dismissing a valid ticket, a passenger doubting a seat assignment, a stranger questioning someone's presence in a space they believed wasn't meant for them. Each moment was small, fleeting, almost inconsequential on its own, but together, they formed a pattern too glaring to ignore. This time, though, there would be consequences, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Elena had no desire to see Catherine humiliated or punished for the sake of punishment. But she also understood that change didn't happen without accountability. And this moment, small as it might seem, could be the catalyst for something larger. Her phone buzzed in her hand, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Chloe, her assistant, calling to confirm the details of the follow-up meeting with the airline's CEO. Elena answered, her tone calm and deliberate. "Yes, I've landed," she said, her voice steady as ever. "Let's ensure everything is in place for tomorrow. I want to hear their plan before we discuss next steps." Blank. Back on the plane, Catherine was the last to leave the cabin, her shoulders heavy with the weight of the day. She walked down the jet bridge slowly, her mind replaying every decision she had made, each one feeling more careless than the last. As she entered the terminal, two security officers approached her, their expressions neutral but firm. "Ms. Wells?" one of them asked. Catherine nodded, her throat tightening. "We need to ask you a few questions about today's flight," the officer said. "If you'll come with us, please." Her heart sank as she followed them down the terminal, her mind racing with what she would say, how she could possibly justify her actions. But deep down, Catherine knew there was no justification, only a mistake she couldn't undo. Blank. Elena reached the baggage claim, her briefcase still in hand, though she had little luggage to retrieve. As she waited, she noticed the glances of other passengers, some curious, others sympathetic. She ignored them, focusing instead on the notifications pinging on her phone. Emails from colleagues, messages from the airline's executive team, and a single note from Chloe. "CEO confirmed for 10 a.m. tomorrow. They seem eager to resolve this." Elena exhaled quietly, slipping the phone into her bag. The work was just beginning. As she walked toward the exit, the hum of the airport faded behind her. This wasn't the first time she had faced prejudice, nor would it likely be the last. But today felt different. Today, she had the tools, and the resolve, to ensure that what happened to her would not happen again. Not to her, not to anyone, outside, The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the pavement. Elena stepped into the cool evening air, her posture as steady as ever, her thoughts already focused on the next steps ahead. The morning sun filtered through the tall glass windows of the airline's corporate headquarters, casting long streaks of light across the sleek, minimalist conference room. Elena Monroe sat at one end of the large table, her back straight, her expression calm but resolute. In front of her, a leather-bound notebook and pen rested neatly, untouched. She had come prepared, though she knew her strongest weapon today wouldn't be documents or charts, it would be her presence. Across from her sat James Caldwell, the airline's CEO, in his late 50s, with neatly combed silver hair and a suit that seemed tailored for authority. He exuded the kind of confidence that came with years of navigating corporate crises. Yet there was a slight tension in his posture, a stiffness in his smile, as though he understood the precariousness of the moment. "Ms. Monroe," he began, his tone carefully measured, "thank you for taking the time to meet with us this morning. First, let me offer my sincerest apologies for what you experienced on our flight. What happened was unacceptable, and we are committed to addressing it thoroughly." Elena inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his words without betraying any emotion. "I appreciate the apology, Mr. Caldwell," she replied, her voice steady, "but I'm less interested in apologies and more concerned with what comes next." James nodded, adjusting the papers in front of him. "Of course, our team has already begun an internal review. We've interviewed the crew involved, including Ms. Wells, and we've spoken with other passengers to ensure we have a clear understanding of the situation." "And what have you concluded so far?" Elena asked, her gaze unwavering. James hesitated, glancing briefly at the airline's legal advisor seated beside him. "It's clear that mistakes were made," he said. "Ms. Wells acted based on assumptions rather than facts, and her actions reflected a lapse in judgment that doesn't align with our company's values." Elena leaned forward slightly, her hands folded neatly on the table. "And what about the environment that allowed those assumptions to take precedence? This isn't just about one flight attendant's lapse in judgment. It's about a culture that tolerates implicit bias, whether consciously or not." The room grew quiet, the weight of her words settling heavily over the table. James shifted in his seat, his expression thoughtful. "You're absolutely right," he said finally. "We recognize that this incident is symptomatic of larger issues, and we're committed to addressing them at every level." Elena nodded, her calm demeanor unchanged. "Good. Then let's talk specifics. Blank. Blank." For the next hour, the conversation unfolded with deliberate precision. Elena outlined her concerns with the clarity of someone who had spent years advocating for systemic change. She spoke not just of her own experience but of the countless others who had likely faced similar treatment. Their stories left unheard. "The issue," she said, her voice even, "isn't simply about individual behavior. It's about the systems that fail to prevent it. Training, accountability, reporting structures. These are the areas where change must begin." James listened intently, occasionally taking notes or exchanging glances with his team. "We're already implementing mandatory bias and sensitivity training for all employees," he offered at one point. "Not just flight attendants, but every level of our organization. Additionally, we're reviewing our complaint and escalation procedures to ensure incidents like this are addressed swiftly and fairly." Elena allowed a brief nod of approval but pressed further. "Training is a start, but it's not enough. How will you measure its effectiveness? How will you ensure accountability beyond the initial wave of attention?" James met her gaze, a flicker of respect crossing his features. "We're working on creating benchmarks for progress," he said, "and I'll personally ensure that our board reviews these measures regularly. Blank. Blank." As the meeting continued, Elena felt a quiet satisfaction growing within her. This wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was movement. And movement, she knew, was the first step toward progress. At the close of the discussion, James stood, extending a hand toward her. "Ms. Monroe, thank you for your patience and your candor. I can assure you, this incident will not be forgotten." Elena rose gracefully, shaking his hand. "I'll hold you to that. Mr. Caldwell, words are important, But action is what matters. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Later, as Elena left the building, her thoughts drifted back to the flight. To the moment Catherine Wells had asked her to move, and to the quiet resolve she had carried since. She thought of the passengers who had looked on, unsure whether to intervene, and of Maya Hart, the young flight attendant who had treated her with simple kindness when it mattered most. This was how change began, not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but with steady, deliberate steps. It was the conversations behind closed doors, the policies rewritten in quiet meetings, the small, incremental shifts that eventually reshaped an entire culture. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Back at the airport, Catherine sat alone in a small, windowless office, waiting to hear the outcome of her disciplinary hearing. The hours felt endless, her thoughts looping through every decision she had made on that flight. She knew she had been wrong, there was no denying that now, but the full weight of her actions didn't truly settle until she saw her reflection in the dark glass of the office door. A professional who had once prided herself on good judgment, now faced with the reality of her biases. When the door finally opened, a senior HR representative entered, her expression calm but firm. "Ms. Wells," she began, "the panel has reviewed the case. Given the seriousness of the incident and its impact, we've decided to terminate your employment with the airline." Catherine's breath caught, the words hitting harder than she expected. She nodded, unable to muster a response. "We hope this experience serves as a chance for reflection," the representative continued, "and we encourage you to take this opportunity to learn and grow." Catherine left the building quietly, the weight of her dismissal pressing heavy on her shoulders. For the first time, she began to truly reckon with what Elena Monroe had shown her, the undeniable, uncomfortable truth that assumptions, no matter how small, could carry consequences far greater than she had ever imagined. Blank. Underscore. Blank. As Elena rode back to her office, the city skyline stretched before her, bathed in the golden light of late morning. She opened her notebook and jotted down a single line. Change begins with accountability but must be sustained through persistence. The work wasn't done, far from it. But today, the ground had shifted just enough to give her hope. And sometimes, hope was enough to start a revolution. Weeks had passed since the meeting at the airline's corporate office. Yet the echoes of that day continued to resonate. Elena Monroe sat in her quiet home office, sunlight streaming through the wide windows. On her desk lay a stack of documents detailing the airline's new policies, updated training protocols, revised complaint procedures, and timelines for their implementation. The weight of the changes was tangible, but Elena knew the journey was far from over. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The airline had wasted no time announcing their new initiatives. Public statements emphasized a commitment to fairness, equity, and accountability. There was language about zero tolerance for bias, about creating a culture of inclusion and respect. Elena had reviewed the statements carefully. They were well crafted, undoubtedly by a skilled PR team. But for her, the question was never about appearances. It was about follow-through. She had received calls and messages from others who had heard about the incident, some strangers, others acquaintances who shared their own experiences of being dismissed, judged, or underestimated. Their stories varied, but the undercurrent was the same: subtle indignities that had compounded over time into a quiet, exhausting fight to be seen as equal. Elena listened to each story with patience, offering words of encouragement but also a gentle reminder: change required persistence. Small steps add up, she told them. Every ripple matters, even if it feels insignificant at first. Blank. Underscore. Blank. At the airline, the changes were starting to show. New training programs were rolled out across all departments. Workshops on unconscious bias became mandatory, and supervisors were held accountable for implementing inclusive practices. The first few sessions were met with resistance from some employees. But over time, the tone began to shift. For many, the training sessions served as a wake-up call. Conversations that had once been avoided, about race, privilege, and assumptions, were now taking place in staff rooms, in break areas, in quiet moments before flights. They weren't always comfortable, but they were necessary. Among those affected most deeply was Maya Hart, the young flight attendant who had shown Elena kindness during the flight. Maya had been promoted to a leadership role, a recognition of her professionalism and empathy. She took her new responsibilities seriously, determined to foster the kind of environment that Elena had spoken about during their brief interaction. One afternoon, after a training session, Maya stood in the galley of a plane preparing for boarding. A fellow attendant approached her, their expression hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" they said, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "That training today, did it feel like a lot to you? Like they're overcorrecting?" Maya paused, considering her response carefully. "I think," she said slowly, "that it feels like a lot because we've gone so long without addressing it. It's not about overcorrecting, it's about finally correcting." The attendant nodded thoughtfully, falling quiet as they returned to their tasks. Maya watched them go, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Change was slow, but it was happening. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Meanwhile, Catherine Wells had taken a different path. Her termination from the airline had forced her into a period of introspection she hadn't anticipated. For weeks, she avoided talking about what had happened, burying herself in excuses and half-hearted justifications. But the quiet moments, those long hours in the solitude of her home, left little room for avoidance. Eventually, she began to confront the uncomfortable truths she had been running from. She started reading, watching documentaries, attending community forums about equity and inclusion. It was humbling, and at times, deeply uncomfortable, but with each step, Catherine felt a small piece of the person she wanted to become into focus. One day, she sent an email to the nonprofit where she had started volunteering. The subject line was simple: "How I can do better." She wasn't sure what the future held, but she was determined to contribute meaningfully, even if it was just a small drop in a much larger ocean. Blank. Underscore. Blank. For Elena, the ripples of change extended beyond the airline. Other companies had reached out, inviting her to consult on diversity initiatives. She accepted a few of the offers but declined most. Her focus remained on ensuring the airline followed through on their promises. She didn't want to spread herself too thin. Impact required focus. One evening, as she reviewed updates from the airline's board, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Chloe, her assistant. "Thought you'd like to know, Ms. Wells has been working with a diversity nonprofit. Small world." Elena read the message twice, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. She set the phone down, her expression unreadable. Catherine Wells had not been on her mind recently, but the thought of her taking steps toward growth stirred a quiet sense of possibility. Perhaps, Elena thought, even the most rigid assumptions could be softened with time. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The next time Elena boarded a plane, it was for a speaking engagement at a conference on systemic change. As she stepped into the cabin, she immediately noticed the difference. The flight crew greeted her warmly, their interactions with passengers measured and thoughtful. The atmosphere felt lighter, less strained, as though the tension she had felt weeks ago had been replaced with something closer to respect. Seated in first class was Maya, now leading the flight. Their eyes met briefly, and Maya offered a genuine smile. Elena returned it with a nod, a quiet acknowledgement of the progress they both represented. As the plane ascended, Elena gazed out the window at the clouds below. She thought of the ripples that had started with a single moment of indignity, now spreading outward in ways she couldn't have fully anticipated. It wasn't about her, not anymore. It was about everyone who had been denied dignity, who had been told, implicitly or explicitly, that they didn't belong. She opened her notebook and wrote a single line. Change requires more than a moment. It demands persistence, humility, and the courage to continue. The clouds stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and Elena allowed herself a small smile. There was still so much work to be done, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hope. The morning light poured through the terminal's wide windows, casting soft golden hues across the bustling airport. Elena Monroe moved quietly through the crowd, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She was calm, composed, her briefcase swinging lightly at her side. This was her first flight since the changes had begun to take root at the airline. And though she didn't seek validation, she was curious to see what progress had been made. The gate was unusually quiet for this time of morning. Passengers waited in loose clusters. Some chatting, others scrolling through their phones. Elena found a seat near the corner. Her eyes drifting across the room. She noticed the gate agents behind the desk, each interaction deliberate and professional. There was a measured tone in their voices. A subtle attentiveness she hadn't seen before. It was small, but noticeable. When her group was called to board, Elena rose and joined the line, feeling the faint weight of expectation in her chest. As she approached the gate, the agent smiled warmly. "Good morning, Ms. Monroe," the young man said, scanning her ticket. "Thank you for flying with us today." Elena inclined her head, offering a polite smile. "Thank you." She stepped onto the jet bridge, the familiar hum of the plane growing louder with each step. Inside the cabin, a flight attendant stood at the entrance, her uniform immaculate, her expression open and friendly. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Monroe," the attendant said, her voice calm and genuine. "If you need anything during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask." Elena nodded again, her gaze briefly meeting the attendant's. "Thank you, I appreciate it, blank, underscore, blank." As she settled into her seat, Elena felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The atmosphere in the cabin was different, lighter, more intentional. The interactions between the crew and the passengers were thoughtful, their smiles unforced. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was progress, and progress was enough for now. As the other passengers filed in, Elena retrieved her notebook and pen. Flipping to a fresh page, she began jotting notes for her next meeting. Her thoughts focused yet calm. She didn't notice the flight attendant approaching until she spoke. "Excuse me, Ms. Monroe," the voice said gently. Elena looked up, surprised to see a familiar face. Maya Hart stood there, now wearing the insignia of a senior flight attendant on her uniform. Her smile was warm, but there was something else in her expression, an unspoken gratitude. Perhaps, or a quiet pride. "I just wanted to say thank you," Maya continued, her voice steady but soft. "For everything you've done. I don't think you realize how much of a difference it's made." Elena paused, her pen hovering over the page. She regarded Maya for a moment, the sincerity in her words unmistakable. "Thank you, Maya," she said finally, her voice low but firm. "But you're the one making the difference now. I'm just glad to see it." Maya smiled again, the kind of smile that lingers long after the moment has passed. "Well, if you need anything during the flight, I'll be here." Elena watched as Maya walked away, her movements confident and assured. It struck her how far the young woman had come since that fateful flight. It wasn't just a promotion, it was a transformation. The kind of change that ripples outward, touching everyone around it. Blank, underscore, blank. The flight took off smoothly, the engines roaring softly as the plane ascended into the open sky. Elena gazed out the window, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the clouds seemed to stretch endlessly. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, not just this flight, but the one weeks ago that had sparked something far larger than she could have imagined. She thought of Catherine Wells, who had since reached out to her with an unexpected apology. The email had been honest, even vulnerable, acknowledging the biases that had led to that moment and detailing the steps Catherine was taking to learn and grow. Elena had read the message twice before replying, her words measured but sincere. "Accountability is the first step. I hope you stay on this path." And then there was the airline itself. The changes they had implemented weren't perfect, and Elena knew the road ahead would be long and uneven. But there was movement, and in that movement, there was hope. Blank, underscore, blank. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, Elena opened her notebook again. She wrote slowly, deliberately, the pen gliding across the page. "The work is never finished. Change is a process, not a destination, but even the smallest steps forward remind us of what's possible." Closing the notebook, she leaned back in her seat and exhaled quietly. Outside the window, the clouds stretched on, soft and infinite, a reminder that the sky itself offered no boundaries, only beginnings.